Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Millions, if not billions of people trust cloud computing companies to keep their data safe. Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and plenty of others hold a wealth of information about us, some of it deeply personal. But what happens if those companies can't even trust their own servers? Alright, so right around the time that I filmed this episode, Bloomberg Businessweek published an article titled The Big Hack. And as far as information security is concerned, this is an absolute bombshell. In brief, the article says that some servers manufactured by a company called Supermicro had additional components added at the factory without their knowledge when they were being manufactured in China. The chips had the ability to interface with low-level parts of the system and had the ability to read and write parts of the system memory and also transmit and receive data through the network interfaces on the server. Essentially, these chips act like a permanent rootkit, so they would persist even if you had reinstalled the operating system on the server itself. The point behind those chips is to allow a malicious actor remote access into that system and gain kind of a backdoor into a company's network. It could allow the installation of software undetected and be used to either gather data like directly on that server itself, or to get a foothold into a network through some of that software installed to try and probe other parts of that company's network and see if it can gather data from other servers. Effectively, these servers with these chips would get hacked, and then they could be turned around and used to try to hack other systems through software. You can kind of think of it this way. You probably keep the outside doors to your house locked, but how often do you close and lock all the doors inside the house? Not too many companies do that, although things are definitely changing in that regard. But the point behind these servers is, servers that are talking to each other that a company owns are generally going to be a little bit less locked down than if they're facing the internet. And so that's the point behind these chips, is to get a foothold inside the network so that it could then branch out from there and try to get other data, whether that's personal data about customers, or as being inferred by this article, information about the company itself. Maybe some of its proprietary data, maybe some of its like trademark designs, trade secrets, that kind of stuff. Basically try and get intelligence about this company and how it works for whatever reason. So how do these chips get installed? Well, the article goes on to say that basically when these boards from Supermicro were being manufactured by other companies in China, because Supermicro didn't really run its own manufacturing plant, it would contract that work out to other companies, which is a totally normal thing. Plenty of other companies do that, including Apple and all sorts of other PC manufacturers. Basically, at these factories, the board designs would get slightly altered and these chips would get added to the production line, either through bribery of some of the people working at the factory or just through straight up strong arm tactics, where the people involved in this, let's just say, would leverage their connections and their influence to basically say to the people working at the factory, hey, if you don't want anything bad to happen to you, we need a little bit of time to take a look at these schematics of these servers you're building, and we may need to make some alterations, wink, wink. Basically, the chips would get added during board production, and the article explains that they were absolutely tiny little chips, and as time went on, they kept getting more sophisticated to the point where they were so small that they could fit them in between some of the layers of the PCB so that they weren't even visible on the surface of the board. The only way you could detect them would be with an X-ray. And then also, because the chips were so small, it was very unlikely for customers to actually even notice them when they were buying and installing these servers. Because, I mean, how often do you actually take something that you buy apart to confirm that everything in it is as it should be? And even then, how often do you order a thing or buy a thing and take it apart and know exactly what every single component inside of it does and how the thing is supposed to work, right? So the idea is these servers were manufactured in such quantities, generally in the thousands, that it was figured that even if some of them went out with this chip installed, that the customer just wouldn't catch it. They wouldn't know how to catch it, or the volume of servers coming in and they wanted to get them installed quickly and up and running would mean that they just would let some of them slip through and these chips would end up in servers that went into production. Now, who was behind all of this? Well, of course, as with politics these days, the finger is getting pointed at China, and specifically China's military arm that's got some kind of IT and cybersecurity special ops that, supposedly has been known to do this sort of thing before. They're the ones who designed these chips and went to the factories and in one way or another managed to get these chips installed. And these servers that Supermicro manufactured ended up going out to companies like Apple and Amazon. Those were the two that were named specifically in the article. But then peripherally, those servers that went to Amazon supposedly ended up in the hands of even some government agencies here in the United States. So it went through Amazon through a subsidiary that they had purchased called Elemental Technologies, who did video compression, like on-the-fly video compression kind of stuff. And so that's how it ended up in the hands of some of that company's customers. Some of them were for very innocuous purposes, like customers who wanted to just do live streaming out on the internet. And others, like I said, for government agencies, for dealing with like security footage or any sort of internal video use that needed to get transcoded or compressed or whatever on the fly for other purposes. So these servers could have gotten put into places, at least through that Amazon supply chain, into some fairly sensitive locations, as the article describes. The other company that these servers supposedly ended up in the hands of was Apple as part of its iCloud infrastructure, specifically related to some of what Siri's doing. Well, after this article dropped, basically the response from all the companies and agencies named was quick and surprisingly detailed. Normally, you would expect it to be a fairly kind of, nebulous kind of response out of these companies, because PR statements are usually rarely specific about, what's been going on. It's usually just kind of a quick boilerplate. What can the PR person think of, not maybe having all that much technical knowledge about what's going on, to refute these claims, to, help the company save face and all of that. Well, surprisingly, these responses were pretty well detailed. Basically, Amazon said that the entire article is just untrue and that it had never found any evidence of those chips. It did admit to a software security vulnerability in some of the Supermicro servers that it had purchased, but that was in those servers' web management interface, and it had been discovered and fixed back in like early 2014. So it sounded like a pretty, typical software bug kind of issue. Apple likewise refuted the claims, but it probably went the deepest and most detailed of any of the responses. And in some ways, Apple kind of came out swinging with its response. You can tell by reading through it, and I'll include a link to all these responses down in the description. I encourage you to read not only the article, but also these responses. It seems like it's just downright pissed about this whole situation. Of course, it said that, the article is untrue, and Apple even went on to say that Bloomberg had contacted them multiple times throughout the past year about these sorts of claims that Bloomberg had learned from various anonymous sources, some of whom claimed to be in the US government, various branches of it. And every time Apple had been contacted by Bloomberg, it went and did an internal investigation about it and came back to find that there was just no evidence to support Bloomberg's claims. It also said that they have never been in contact with the FBI about this, which is a direct refute of a claim made in the article saying that the FBI and all these companies were trying to cooperate on figuring out what was going on. There was a lot of back and forth collaboration going on. Apple says nope, we've never even talked to the FBI about anything like this. Nobody in law enforcement that Apple has ever worked with had heard of a story or a situation like this. It also refuted some of the claims about the article's numbers. The article said that 7,000 servers that Apple had ordered from Supermicro had been compromised with this particular chip. Apple said, no. The total number of servers that we had ever gotten from Supermicro related to iCloud was only 2,000, and that those servers had never actually really had anything to do with Siri, which was something that the article said was being powered by these servers that had been compromised. So Apple's saying, nope, not even, not only are these servers, have no evidence of having been compromised, but Bloomberg basically even got the numbers wrong on the article. Now, Supermicro had a response that was quite a bit shorter and a bit more generic, kind of more along the lines of what I would expect. Basically just said it's not aware of any investigations regarding a situation like this, but it also pointed out that if there was an investigation like it would fully comply, because while Supermicro does a lot of manufacturing in China and Taiwan, it is an American company. It's based in California. It also said that it hasn't heard of any loss of customers from an issue like this, which is another direct refute to a claim made by the article, and that supposedly some Supermicro customers, after having discovered or learned of this particular chip being embedded in some systems, had cut ties with Supermicro. And Supermicro said, nope, we are not aware of customers basically bailing on Supermicro due to an issue like this. Well, all right, so let's analyze that just a little bit here. As you can probably tell, I'm trying to stay a little bit a step back from really getting into going after this article. But there is something that doesn't quite make sense with Supermicro's statement based on some of the other evidence that we had. Supermicro says that it's never lost any customers related to an issue like this. Well, Apple said in its response, in kind of a more lengthened response that it posted separate from what Bloomberg had published, and good on Bloomberg for publishing these responses from the companies, Apple said that yes, it had been a Supermicro customer, but it is no longer a Supermicro customer after discovering a, quote, infected driver in one particular Supermicro server that it had in its testing lab. So Apple confirmed it is no longer a Supermicro customer because it had found an infected driver on one system, and Supermicro is saying that it's never lost any customers based on an issue like this. If you want to get pedantic, yes, I suppose both of those statements can jive with each other. If you're reading into it as Supermicro saying specifically we haven't lost any customers due to embedded chips. But at the same time, it's also kind of curious that Apple said, yeah, we no longer do business with Supermicro because we found one server with an infected driver in a test lab system. Well, infected software happens all of the time, and it's curious that Apple would drop an entire supplier because of one system that it found, especially since an infected driver is going to be a software thing, right? You wipe the system, you reinstall the software from known good and safe sources, and you should be okay. Now, maybe Apple's being a little bit vague in that statement. Maybe it actually meant that there could have been something hardware going on. We know that Apple likes to mince words a little bit and kind of bend the truth when it's talking, in PR statements like this, try to make things not seem as bad as they are. And a lot of companies do the same thing. That's modus operandi for PR in general. But those two things really don't kind of jive with each other to me, right? Like, why would Apple bail on a whole company over one infected software driver? The other thing that kind of has me thinking, and I'm not surprised about this either, is the response from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, basically saying that it cooperates with other governments regarding cybersecurity issues and that it takes the supply chain security seriously of products being manufactured in its country. But it even went on to say that it's a victim of supply chain tampering. and just kind of a whole bunch of other boilerplate kind of text after that, never really talking specifically about these chips. It never, this ministry response never came out and said specifically, we have no proof of these chips ever having been used or installed or developed or anything like that. It then just kind of went on to attack the article fairly vaguely and say, oh, we wish that, people would be more careful with their reporting, that kind of stuff. So I guess a not surprising response from something, like the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But at the same time, the failure to address that issue specifically while the other companies did is kind of curious. Now, I'm not the kind of person who likes to put on a tinfoil hat, and I'm not going to read into this any more deeply than I have to. But I'm also going to tell you that I don't necessarily 100% trust this article. And a lot of people are looking at this particular article fairly skeptically, as I think everyone should. Everyone should look at everything that they read with a bit of a skeptical eye and try to seek out other opinions and viewpoints and figure out on their own what seems to make the most sense. And I don't think necessarily this article gets the scope of things correctly. I don't think it necessarily gets the impact of things correct. I don't think it's nearly as bad of a situation as this article tries to claim it to be. However, I believe that something like this has happened, and if it hasn't happened, it definitely could happen. Why do I think that? Well, that's because I think we've seen some of this sort of thing before. We've definitely seen software vulnerabilities in these low-level management systems on not only servers, but also just desktop computers. Not too long ago, there were reports of vulnerabilities in Intel's management engine software, which is something that's very similar to where these chips are getting positioned, but it's just baked into the chipset itself, where you could use it to manage the system at a very low level. If you remember a video that I posted a while back where I gave a tour of these really big ass servers that I had decommissioned at work, I talked about the remote management part of those servers and how there's a web interface you can get into that's independent of the operating system that's running on the server, where you can do things like power the server on and off and reboot it and change settings and check statistics like what's the internal temperature and have any parts failed, that sort of thing. That management part is exactly what they were talking about in Amazon's response about there was a software web interface bug that had gotten found and fixed. It was actually in that remote management interface where they found that. Now, because you have access to the remote management interface, at least the web portion of it, doesn't necessarily mean you can completely own the entire system. However, it is all connected internally. So it definitely is possible that given these sorts of vulnerabilities, basically bad code or bugs in the code, that a malicious actor could take advantage of them, especially on servers that are exposed and facing the internet at large, to go in and use them to their advantage, whether it's to glean statistics and information about a company's internal operations, or based on the type of vulnerability that it is, be able to actually get that foothold in to install software undetected on that server that it can then execute and use to gather data or try to internally attack other systems. And then what's more, there's talk about these types of hardware implants, and I've seen lots of people who have hardware engineering backgrounds saying, yeah, it is entirely possible for this to happen. Is it as easy as one guy walking into a factory and managing to slip a reel of parts onto a pick and place machine and having it drop this part in place of a signal conditioning device or a capacitor or resistor or something like that and have it work? No, it's nowhere near that simple. They can't just take one part off the motherboard and put this other part in its place that's, that tiny and that innocuous and not have someone notice. It does involve basically redesigning a portion of, if not the entire board. So is it plausible? Yes, it is absolutely plausible for this sort of thing to happen. Is it likely? That's what I'm a bit undecided on. I think given enough time, and if the manufacturers being contracted to build this stuff are lax enough or are in on the deal, yeah, we definitely could see something like this, but I'm not entirely sure that makes a ton of sense, especially since a lot of this stuff would get found out eventually, right? It could get traced back. If there's a part that's been added to a server motherboard, you can figure out where that came from. Especially if it's a part that has to get so deeply embedded into the design and architecture of that board in order to work, there are really only two places that you could blame. Either the company that originally designed it or the company that was contracted to manufacture it. It's not more like a software vulnerability where there's a lot more places where something like that could happen. I mean, yeah, there could be a bug in a piece of code somewhere, and you could probably track that back to who or when that code was written, but exactly who exploited that code, who took advantage of that vulnerability, is a lot harder to track down because, well, you know, the world is a pretty big place, even though it's small on the internet. And there are a lot of companies and countries and organizations that have a desire to go in and do this sort of malicious behavior, whether it's for profit or for their own country's gain or for another country's loss or whatever. So basically, you know, I'm a little skeptical on this article. I do think, however, it's a good thing that an article like this came out, because even if the article is factually untrue as to exactly the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why, the fact that it's actually bringing this issue to light is a good thing, because hardware is like the final frontier when it comes to information security. The trust model of security systems kind of starts at the top and works its way down, where the least amount of trust is at the top, where your applications and your data actually lives. The most amount of trust is at the bottom with your hardware. If you can't trust your own hardware to do exactly what you tell it to do and not work against you and not be compromised by someone else, then you can't trust anything else in that stack. You can't then trust your operating system because the hardware can control what the operating system does because it's able to read and write the contents of memory. It's able to alter CPU instructions. You can basically change the OS out from underneath it. And that's supposedly what's been going on with these chips getting embedded in these systems. And then on the way up through there. So if the OS is then hacked, then you can't trust your applications so much because the applications have to rely on the OS to get their work done. It kind of just defeats the entire trust chain if you can't believe in your hardware. It's a really good thing, I think, that this is being brought to light because, yeah, we've definitely seen quite a bit of like firmware and some level of hardware vulnerabilities being released over the last couple of years, especially with the whole CPU thing, the Spectre and Meltdown issues that got brought up with the way modern CPUs operate, and some CPUs being vulnerable and others not, but it being a big enough deal where the industry actually has had to change about it. I mean, Intel has had to kind of go back and rethink about how it's designing CPUs, especially when a lot of these CPUs can't physically be fixed. They rely on software patches on the top in order to mitigate the vulnerabilities that lie within. You know, I'm glad to see that we're at least looking at the rest of that spectrum now to figure out how do we work around these types of issues. Can we try to get to a model where maybe the operating system can work in such a way where it's a little bit more resilient against compromised hardware? Maybe it's a warning call that we need to have tighter control over how our hardware gets manufactured and who it gets designed by. Of course, there are plenty of challenges that come with doing that, especially given the nature of how a lot of basically IT equipment gets manufactured, how there's tons of outsourcing and subcontracting and subcontracting going on. How do you verify that every single part that goes into your system is what you expect? How do you verify that your designs haven't been modified? It can become very complicated and very expensive if you really try to go down that rabbit hole. Is there another way to fix this? These are all very good questions that I'm glad at least are being raised by this article, even though personally I think the article kind of misses the mark. I'm not willing to write the article off completely. I mean, who knows? In time, maybe we'll get additional evidence that suggests that Amazon and Apple and Supermicro and all the others were actually lying all along, and it turns out the article was correct. I don't know. There's just too little information, at least at the time I'm filming this. I think the simplest answer is one of, well, what's the most likely scenario? Before you start devolving into various theories and letting your mind run away, coming up with all these crackpot types of ideas and all that, just going completely down into that rabbit hole. I think maybe just not necessarily accepting this at face value, but looking at it a little bit more skeptical, but also a little bit more, these are pretty far-fetched claims. How true are they really? I think maybe that's the best way to go about it. But, as I said, we'll definitely see more detail as time goes on, either confirming this article or refuting it. And I, for one, am really interested in seeing where this one goes. Now, something fairly interesting, and not directly related to this article, but I found to be very complimentary to this whole discussion. The same day that Bloomberg article came out, a bunch of Mac sites, especially ones that specialize in Mac rumors and Apple news, published an article about how machines, Apple computers that use the T2 chip, have to start going through this process to basically verify and certify their hardware after certain components inside them get replaced or repaired. The machines that have that chip are the 2018 series MacBook Pros and the iMac Pro, but it's very likely that as time goes on, other Macs will include this chip. And the chip is a coprocessor that's designed to combine multiple functions, including largely the encryption of data on the system and the drive controller, but also things like the display and audio and system control and that other sorts of stuff. It basically combines a whole bunch of discrete functions into one chip that can manage them comprehensively. And so this article said that whenever repairs on those systems need to need to go through, whether you have to replace a logic board, or in the case of the laptops, they're talking about like the display or the keyboard or some of the other parts, that this particular piece of software needs to be run on the machines that basically goes through a hardware test and verifies everything in the system as it should be. And that piece of software is only available to Apple stores and Apple authorized repair facilities because it hooks up to Apple's servers in the cloud. It's not just a piece of software you have on like a USB flash drive and it just runs on its own. It actually needs to be able to communicate with the internet to return the results of the repair back to Apple to confirm this particular machine, like with this serial number, has been repaired and all the parts check out, that sort of thing. And there was, of course, a big outcry, especially amongst the Mac faithful, saying that, well, this is just even, furthering Apple's anti-right to repair type of standpoint, because now you can't repair your own computer. If you have an iMac Pro and the SSDs in it were to fail, basically, you would have to take your computer in and have this software run on it, even if you were capable of doing the hardware swap yourself. Same thing with the MacBook Pro. If your keyboard were to fail, you could buy a replacement one, swap your motherboard and all the other parts into it. You would still have to have this software run on it before the computer would even function properly. And rightfully so, it's a major shot across the bow of independent repair for Apple computers like this. And I completely agree with all the people saying that it's unacceptable and that it's an absolute attack on the ability for consumers to repair items themselves. And lots of people even wondering, well, okay, fine, maybe it's the logic board that needs to go through it, but why the other parts? Why does the display need to be, counted in this? Why does the keyboard need to be counted in this? It's just a keyboard. You type on it. It sends signals to the motherboard. Why, what security aspect does that have? Why does all of these additional parts, especially on the MacBook Pros, why did they fall under the scope of needing to go through this verification? And yes, it definitely frustrates a lot of people. But the first thought that I had when I read that article about needing to run that software on repaired machines immediately brought me back to this Bloomberg article. Because if you think about it, if you've got a chip on the motherboard of a system that's able to verify all the other components on that motherboard are legit and working properly, that's actually really awesome in terms of security. That's a major boon for the security of that system because the system itself knows what's legit and what's not, unless there are vulnerabilities found in that T2 coprocessor, which admittedly there could be. There haven't been any reported ones at the time I'm filming this, but unless there's a vulnerability in that coprocessor itself, generally having something like that on the system does enhance the overall system security. And so that's a very good thing. Why the keyboard and the display on the laptops are being included is, well, if you think about it, yeah, so the keyboard is an input device and it's a fairly simple thing, but at the same time, you're inputting information into it. If you're familiar at all with viruses or malware, you've probably heard of the concept of a keylogger, where it's a piece of software that runs on your computer and simply basically tracks everything you're typing into the keyboard and can then transmit to something else. Well, what if the things that you're typing into the keyboard include usernames and passwords? Now, a software keylogger is something that can be easily detected and removed sooner or later, but what if that keylogger exists in hardware? What if the keylogger is built into the keyboard itself? Same thing with the display. I mean, it's just a screen, right? You can see what's on screen, but what if what you're displaying on screen is sensitive information? And what if there's a chip built into that screen that's capable of, oh, I don't know, taking a screenshot every few seconds and storing it or transmitting it somewhere else? Well, now you can't trust the screen or the keyboard in your computer to keep your computer safe, even though the motherboard itself may be fully secure and hadn't been modified at all. So by including those other parts into this whole verification program, it's kind of preventing something like this whole big hack type of scenario from happening, at least to the consumer-focused machines that Apple sells. You know, it's a good thing. The fact that Apple seems, at least, you know, by looking at it that way, to be actually taking system security seriously, even at the hardware level, is a really good thing. And it jives with a lot of what Apple has been saying in terms of, you know, how it believes in security. Maybe the more skeptical people, maybe the people who don't like Apple or have always questioned Apple's motives, would then look at this more like a, well, yeah, but they're also locking down the system a little more. What do they know? Is this more of a knee-jerk reaction because something has happened to Apple in the past? I don't know, but I think it does continue kind of a pattern that Apple has been following, especially, you know, with the stories about, you know, replacement displays for iPhones and replacement Touch ID buttons for iPhones not working, like third-party replacement ones not manufactured by Apple, them getting locked out from software updates or just the phone not working with them installed. It makes a lot of sense. It follows along with that pattern, but it's another one of those things where you can kind of read into it either way, for good or for bad. Now, you know, again, personally, I'm kind of on the fence about this sort of thing. Yeah, it's a major bummer because if the keyboard in your 2018 or whatever MacBook Pro were to fail, then you can't go and get it replaced on your own with a third-party generic part, right? I mean, we know that the keyboards on those computers are built into the top case. It's not easily separable. If you need to replace the keyboard, you have to replace the entire top case. Last time I heard, that part from Apple is several $100s just for that top case and keyboard. You know, without locking that sort of thing down, would it be possible to see third-party generic or refurbished keyboards and top cases in a few years' time for much less money than that? Well, yeah, absolutely. Third-party repair parts are a great option when the manufacturer parts are, you know, too expensive or overpriced. And we see that with the auto industry all the time. There's tons of third-party replacement parts out there for cars that work usually just as well as the originals, but are significantly less expensive. The difference is the automakers haven't, at least not too badly, yet started locking people out of being able to repair their own cars. Unlike the computer industry, which has started to head more and more in that direction. So, you know, on that one side of things, it is frustrating. And I completely agree with all the people who are really pissed at Apple about this sort of thing because the machines are already fairly expensive as it is. It's fairly expensive to repair them. And now you have even fewer options to repair them on your own. At the same time, though, the increase in security is a good thing. It's unfortunate that it has to take this form, absolutely. And I wish that Apple would kind of in kind, if they're going to impose these restrictions, maybe drop the prices on its repairs or make the ability to become an authorized service provider easier, make things easier on the existing service providers, because my understanding is that they have it pretty tough as it is. They don't really make a whole ton of money doing, repair work for Apple machines like the legit way. So, if Apple's going to go this route, I wish that they would at least, make things easier. If they're going to say this is the way the game has to be played, at least make it so that more people are able to play that game. Maybe we'll get there in time, maybe we won't, but I do find the timing of those articles and the parallels in the content that they're talking about just it's a little bit more than a coincidence. You know what I mean? It's just, I can't quite put my finger on it, but it seems like the two are somehow linked in one way or another. Anyway, maybe I'm reading into this too much, maybe I'm not, but it's just something that struck me. So I am, of course, curious as to your thoughts about this whole thing, about the whole big hack story. Do you believe in that story? Do you not? How far down does that rabbit hole go, if it even goes anywhere? What do you think about the responses from Apple and Amazon and Supermicro and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and even Bloomberg's own, sticking to this article? What do you think about that? What do you think about Apple and the whole, repair changes now for those machines with the T2 chip? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Do you understand that there's a balance to be had there, or do you see it as more of a, nope, this is only something that hurts consumers? I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Leave them down below. I just ask that you keep it civil. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available on my Patreon page for supporters at all contribution levels. It's just a plain MP3 download, plus there's private RSS feed support, so you can load it into the podcast player of your choice. And these episodes go live a few days before they show up on YouTube. So it's just a great way to support the channel, and hope you consider it. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.